Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Life After Diets. I'm here with Sarah, and today we're talking about eating when you know you don't want to be eating. So I don't know who else has had this experience of almost watching yourself eating a food, feeling like you're physically full, knowing that you're done with the physical act of eating, but you can't seem to stop, and why this happens and why are we doing this? And Sarah, what are your thoughts on this one? Do you have an experience with it, or do you work with people who talk about having this happen to them, and what do you make of it?
I hear a lot of people saying they hate binge eating. People will tell me sometimes that they hate food. Sometimes I work with someone and they'll say, I struggle with food because I love it so much. And then there are people who say, no, I hate food. If I could just take a pill for every meal instead of actually have to face food every day, then that would be my preference. It can be so confusing and so distressing to feel like you are eating against your own will. And that experience of, sometimes you talk about it as like watching yourself. I'd feel like in a bit of a trance. I can remember walking down the street and like my legs just taking me into the store. I didn't feel like I even made that decision. It's like, it can feel like being taken over. And that, I think, is the experience that we're talking about here, as opposed to the experience of, I don't want to eat these foods anymore, but then you really want them and you're thinking about them all the time and you find yourself giving in and eating the foods. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about willpower. We're talking about eating when you really don't want to be eating. So one of the ways I think about this is that the appetite is an extraordinarily powerful drive that we have, right? Second only to the drive to breathe and drink water. And I don't know if you've ever heard like the analogy of the beach ball, and you hold it underwater and then at some point when you let go, it's going to rise to the surface.
Yeah.
And a little bit like you can want to hold your breath and you can be as determined as you want to keep holding your breath, and at some point your brain is just going to force you to breathe. It feels like that mechanism. That's how I understand it. Like it comes from a really primal part of the brain that's been triggered for any number of reasons, like maybe restriction, maybe threat of restriction, maybe something else, because there are traumatic responses as well, I think, that can trigger off this part of the brain. But it's like your animal brain has taken over. And in order for that to happen, your thinking has to switch off. Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yeah. In a few ways, because I think if you'd asked me this before, I would have said no, like I'm just very self-punishing and I'm self-sabotaging. I'm eating when I don't want to be eating because I have some sort of like vendetta against myself. Now, I will say that experience I see as driven by my appetite that I didn't necessarily understand the mechanisms of before. So, for example, when I was in a binge restrict cycle, now I could have binged the day before. And so I would have seen, and then I would have started eating the next day and eating surplus. I'm talking about this surplus eating, not eating in response to actual hunger, but going beyond that. And then the judgment of, I don't want to be eating. I'm full. Why am I eating? And I would have called it self-sabotage. I would have said, I don't want to be eating. But that's my conscious brain that didn't want to be eating. My body was coming from a longer range perspective of, you restrict. Yes, you binged yesterday. Yes, you had lunch today. But we know you're going to restrict again. So I'm going to get it in now. Your appetite overrides your like conscious appetite. And I did not understand that before. In fact, it used to really frustrate me. It made me so mad because it was like, I ate enough, body. Like, I am full. Why are you doing this? But what I failed to see was that my body didn't care necessarily that I was full. It cared about like the past month or the weeks of having times where I was extremely hungry or not filling up enough. And it was preparing for more of that. And so appetite becomes like a relative term. Like, yes, I'm not exactly hungry in this moment, but overall I kind of am. And even if my caloric, needs were being met, it just still knows that there were points where my appetite was not being responded to. And that is a different act. That's coming from a part of your brain that we don't perceive. And I think it's hugely helpful to understand because, yes, your conscious brain does not want to be eating. Yes, your stomach is full and may not want more food objectively, but there is a part of your brain that's acting on your own behalf. And that it is coming from that primal center that we're just not aware of on a conscious level.
I often talk about binge eating as a conflict. There's part of you that wants to binge and part of you that doesn't want to binge. Some people might go, no, there's no part of me that wants to binge. I don't want to binge. But when I say part of you, whatever this binge part is, whether we think of it as something in the unconscious, whether it's primal, there's a part of you that wants to drive this behavior for some reason or another. And I think that when you get sometimes that battle in your mind, let's say it's not even from the primal part. Let's just say that you're up in your thinking mind and you've got one part of you saying, go and eat the thing that's calling for you in the cupboard. And the other part going, don't you dare eat that thing. You'll regret it. You go back and forth. A little bit like we talked about in the emotions episode. I think there's part of the brain that goes, this could go on forever. Like this debate could literally go on forever. The only way to end it is to have the food. Because if you have the food, that stops it. If you don't have the food, it can go on forever. And I can think it can almost happen as a sort of a response to overwhelm as well. From that fighting with yourself, you get more and more tired. It is so exhausting to be battling with yourself. And I think sometimes we just run out of energy. It's almost like another part of the brain takes over and goes, look, just go and have it already, get it over and done with. And then maybe that triggers off some thinking around restriction. Maybe it doesn't satisfy you and then you want more. The I blown it thinking might come in and it could end up leading to a binge from there. I think that's another way people end up being pulled into it, where it feels like it's not what they want to do.
Yes, because I've experienced this both ways. In fact, there are still times where I could almost see this happening, and it's not a restriction-based response. It's that. It's like when I'm really tired or my reserves just aren't there, and if there's any sort of overwhelm, it just makes the decision very quickly. And there's also, I think, another way that this can show up is in rebellion, and that if there's any sort of mental restriction happening or just any idea of thinking, do I want this? Do I want this? No, you shouldn't have it. You shouldn't have it. There's a part of you that's like, well, I'm going to go ahead and eat it then. Like, yes, there's a part of you that's like, no, I don't want it. I don't want to eat it because I shouldn't. And then there's a rebellious side for many people who feel like, well, you're going to tell me not to eat it, so I'm going to eat double. I'm going to keep going. And I think that that's happening a lot. At least it did. It absolutely did for me, where I would watch myself eating something. And there was a part of me that was like smug about it. That was kind of like, meanwhile, the other side of me was like, oh no, it's like devastated. And that might be the side that we're more in tune with and we're aware of when we're saying, I don't want to be eating. But again, it begs the question, well, what part of you does? Like, what's the part of you that does? And considering all of these parts of your brain working as a whole rather than just focusing on the one that we wish were true or the ego that we most want to identify with, but that there's others going on. What else about this food why do you want to be eating it?
Mm-hmm. I was reminded when you were talking of that rush, that euphoria that can come when you've been battling and then you decide to throw all abandon to the wind, to just you're going for it now. It's done. You've broken free.
Yeah.
And that sense of freedom, I think we have a part of us that craves that freedom and that autonomy. And when you try and cage that part, there's an agitation that happens. And when it breaks free, it's like, I have this small window of time, this moment out of prison, if you like, and I've got to kind of fill up now before I get caged again. Because at some point, the other part that tries to control me is going to wake up and it's going to just rugby tackle me to the ground. Mm-hmm. Or American football tackle me to the ground.
We know what rugby is.
What would you call it? You say tackle? Is that what you'd say? If you...
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have football. Well, American football. Tackle. Yeah. Yes. It will tackle you to the ground.
Yeah. That kind of thing. So it's always just running around trying to get away from that part of you that's going to start chasing it real soon.
Yeah. And, there's also the part of eating that's really pleasurable and sometimes for people provides the only source of joy that I think when we're dieting, our world can get very small and food can become the source of momentary happiness. Granted, in the grand scheme of things, you may not consider yourself happy. You may be struggling with depression, but in the moment of eating that food, the chemicals in the brain that respond in that moment and the taste in your mouth is a moment of escape. It's a moment of pleasure. And it may be the only moments of those things that you have access to. And so while your belly may be full or your brain may be telling you, don't do this because it's going to set you up for something worse tomorrow, it's going to ruin your day, all of that comes secondary to as humans that we want pleasure and we want it now, especially if we're suffocating with the absence of it in general, right? So, like when we have the opportunity, we're going to take it. And so that may be another thing at play where you need it in the short term and not necessarily in the long term, but right in this moment, this is how you're accessing pleasure.
Hmm. And that might not even be about not having enough pleasure around food. I think mentioned before this tendency for people to be living this life that you think you're supposed to be living, or taking on extra responsibilities, or trying to please everybody else, trying to be what everybody else wants you to be. I can usually identify these people because they're sometimes described their eating times as me time.
Yeah.
Like that's the only me time that they have.
Yes.
This is the one thing for me, like almost a way of trying to give something to me because I'm not being given anything anywhere else.
Yeah.
I'm giving
Like I
out.
deserve it.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I'm running out. I deserve it. I think that's another one that comes up,
A lot.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I had someone yesterday I was speaking with who said, I wanted this ice cream and I had just dropped my kids off at college and I was going to be alone and I had worked really hard moving them all day. And I thought, nah, you can have it. You deserve it. Like it was like an earned thing. This is a new client, so we're working
Mhm.
on this. Um, but this idea yeah, as food being self care, it's how we find refuge and take care of ourselves and have a moment alone, have a moment of pleasure, all of these things. And so all of that is playing out alongside someone's desire to not overfill or to just be intuitive with food. I mean, that's the idealized version of things where we're eating when we're hungry, stopping when we're full. But there's also this reality of, is this how you are experiencing pleasure in your life or taking care of yourself?
Mhm. And when we talk about all those different parts that we have, considering that all those different parts can have competing wants and needs. So that can almost sound a bit like, well, we're screwed, right? Like we can't, it's again that idea of trying to please everyone, trying to please all the
Yeah.
parts of you. But I think that a lot of the work is about finding ways to negotiate, gently negotiate between those parts. And sometimes parts are going to have to go without. But
Yeah.
if you deprive one part for too long, like eventually it's going to kick off. And I think that when we are very stressed out and when we're anxious and when we're feeling guilty and when there's a lot of emotions around food, it's really difficult to come in and be able to negotiate between different
Mm.
wants and needs. Like it takes a calm in like DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. They talk about the wise mind, this
Mhm.
idea that there's a wiser part of us, a calmer part of us. I mean, most people have some problem solving skills in life that can look at all these things and go like, okay, I have this need for pleasure, but I also have this body that has this need for nourishment. How do I negotiate between those two without tying in my whole self-worth and value
Yeah.
investment in this decision? Because that's what happens when the hyper focus is on
Yeah.
food and weight usually.
Well, then the question a lot of times will come up, well, I can't say no because, or I can't not have it because then I'm restricting. That comes up a lot, especially in after a while of being in a recovered place or an intuitive eating place where the binge eating has subsided and there's, you finally found, you know, you're coasting a little bit for the first time. It's like, I don't want to risk going backwards. So I'm just going to keep this habit essentially up of eating the food when I don't want to because I feel like it would be restricting for me not to do that. And that's where these systems come in of intuitive eating doesn't necessarily mean you indulge in every present moment impulse that you have. And just because, yes, it would feel good and be a bit of an escape, and the food does taste delicious and we need the alone time, that and that would feel good. Sometimes that might be enough, and that might be the appropriate response, is then to have the food when you're not necessarily hungry for it or don't really want it. But there's certainly going to be times where that's not the case, and having the food is actually part of a decision-making process that might warrant saying, "You know what? I know it would feel good in this moment, but overall, my body is done, and I don't actually want it," and giving yourself permission to have the conversation. I've seen where people get stuck in this place of feeling like the answer always has to be yes. If I want it, I have to have it. If I want it in this present moment way, it means I want it and I need to have it because that's what I've been taught, in terms of anti diet, in terms of saying you're allowed, but that also you're allowed not to. And when is that relevant? And how do you navigate it? Like, I think that's probably a bigger question, is how do you know the difference between allowing food and allowing yourself to eat something because you want it and because it would feel good, versus saying no because, yes, there's a part of you that wants it and needs it, but there's other parts of you that doesn't. And how do you know who to listen to and when?
For me, I feel like I've learned the difference with how those two things feel. So when I want food, because actually I just really fancy that food, it feels very different to when I have a compulsive urge to eat something. So I can't say for certain how that feels for other people. But for me, sometimes I wouldn't be sure. And of course, the mind can be really compelling and try and say exactly that. Well, you should not say no to yourself because you're just going to binge later. But I found, coming back to this question, like, does this feel like a peaceful decision? Does it feel like a free choice? If I'm not sure, can I just give it 10 minutes, just see how I feel? I don't mean that as in some kind of distraction technique to try and let the feeling pass, but more of a, if there's a part of me that goes, no, I want it now, it's usually not about the food and experience. That idea that urges feel urgent, it just feels different. And I want that decision to feel peaceful. I want to eat those kinds of foods that I might think of as pleasure foods. I want to eat those foods when it really is just about fancying that particular food, not fancying a whole load of food. Because binges for me was not normally just one particular thing. It might start off with one particular thing, but there was a variety of things that I wanted, all of a similar kind of character and nature. They tended to be like the sugary foods because that was what I was craving. So that feels different, I think. And then that, I don't know, I think we learn that through experimentation. So sometimes you're not sure and you might go like, does this feel compulsive or does it feel like I really fancy the food? I'm not sure. This is early stages. Maybe what I need to do is eat the food and see, but really
Yeah.
notice and try and learn something from this experience. And if actually all these compulsive waves are just getting bigger and bigger, how did that feel at the beginning? What can you take away from that experience that's going to help you next time to be able to tell the difference?
I think this is a place where sometimes it gets tricky to think, okay, even listening to this episode right now, somebody out there might be saying, okay, well, tell me the answer of when I should say yes and when I should say no, because I want to follow that rule. I want to do it right. And I saw a post the other day, again, can't remember where, but it was that every time you eat, you're collecting data, which is so true because in that way, you don't make mistakes. It's not like you can do it right or wrong. You're just simply collecting data. And like to your point, I also have a recognition, and only by collecting data with some amount of intention and awareness, that I know the difference between an impulsive sort of excuse, I don't actually really want this, but my brain is trying to convince me I do, feeling, versus a, nope, that's is definitely what I want and need right now, despite being full or not. There is a difference. Part of that is that, even just the way I say it, where there's that anxious, sort of urgent impulse behind it, or is it calmer and a bit slower and grounded? There's a feeling of that I know the difference between, that I didn't know before. I couldn't tell the difference. There was also a lot of layers piled on both of judgment, which interfered with me being able to tell the difference. And I only be, am able to now tell the difference because I've done it so many times differently. And sometimes I've done it wrong. Like sometimes I have made the decision where I'm like, that wasn't the right one. And I'm glad I did it because now I sort of am more familiar with that. And I have a pattern of of a collection of doing that a lot of times enough that, okay, yeah, that's the way it feels. I needed to do it so many times for me to even understand the way it feels really well. And I think that comes with time and practice and not perfection.
I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors to today's episode. So thank you, Stef.
And thank you, Sarah.
We are sponsoring our own podcast because this is our job. And if you want to connect with any of us or work with either of us, you can connect with me, Sarah. I'm the bingeeatingtherapist.com. That's my website. I am Binge Eating Therapist on Instagram, and I do have a YouTube channel as well called The Binge Eating Therapist. So come and connect with me over there. Stef?
And if you'd like to work with me, I am Stefanie Michele on Instagram and Facebook, and my website is iamstefaniemichele.com. And I'm currently running a 12-week course for anyone looking to heal their relationship with food, coming out of binge eating and emotional eating, and moving towards the foundations of intuitive eating principles. You can email me or just click the link in the show notes. And now back to the episode.
Okay, so hypothetical situation.
Oh,
Someone's in this position. They really want this particular food. They can't stop thinking about it. It feels agitating. They're like, this feels like an urge, but it's building and building. And the whole thing of a compulsive urge is that it's very difficult to resist. In that moment, what do you say to them? Like, if you could in that moment step in and say something to them where it's almost like the compulsive urge has come and it's got its hook in. I know it's a compulsive urge, but because now I know it's a compulsive urge, I'm gonna go and binge.
Yeah. Like honestly, when I'm listening to them, like, oh, they're gonna binge anyway. Like I'm gonna come in after. That's the part where it's like that whole idea of trying to stop something that's so big. I can feel it. You know how you cross that threshold of like, this is happening. This is gonna happen, and anything I'm doing to resist it is gonna make it bigger. To me, that would be a place where I'd be like, this is happening and I'm going to let that ride. And then I'm going to meet myself after and we're going to have a talk. Like, not a reprimanding talk, but like, what's going on? Like, what's this about? What do we have to learn here? Which I know sounds really like teachery and really like coming from a textbook, but I just kind of understand when something in my brain is taken over and talking myself out of it is going to be counterproductive, and that I'm better off moving through it. And then the best thing I can do is to move through it and not judge it, not get caught up in it, not identify with it. That's the part that keeps me spinning, really. I trust that if I have this compulsion that's that big, that there's a reason for that, that I need to access when my higher brain is back online. To me, that is how recovery happened, because I certainly wasn't stopping urges left and right. I was following urges, and then just my response to them was different. I don't think I would have recovered if I had been constantly fielding, because I had to learn what the purpose of this impulse was.
I mean, I would say something pretty similar. I think once you're at that point, the momentum is going, right? And I think a lot of people get frustrated, and I hear this all the time when they go and work with a professional, and the professional will say something like, well, in that moment, sit down and journal.
Yeah.
Splash
water on your face.
Oh, go for a walk, have a bath, distract yourself. Like, once you've crossed that line. And I think that for me, the only times when I started to learn out how to ride out those urges, not even ride out, but like crash right into them by choice, like run into them, was when I anticipated in advance. Anytime it caught me off guard for a long time, if I was caught off guard, that's it, this is happening. And exactly that afterwards, what was the early warning sign? What did I miss? What was going on? And actually playing out, because I sometimes describe it as a tipping point. There's a point where the control is gone. It feels inevitable. Nothing's gonna stop you. Trying to help people identify, like, where was the tipping point? What was the point of no return? Trying to pinpoint that and almost going back and replaying it. What would I have done different in the lead up to that?
Yeah.
Because without really thinking through what you would do differently and thinking, well, next time I just won't binge. That's what people do. They say, next time I just won't binge. It's like, it's going to take more than that. It's going to take more, because when it's got its hooks in you, it's too powerful at that point.
It is. And it's so funny, because I almost want to say that the number of times that the tipping point for me was literally the fighting it that was the tipping point itself.
Mhm.
Like I almost could make more peace with a binge if it felt coming from something much stronger than me that I had nothing to do with, like an emotion or something happening that triggered me, that sent me into some place. That to me felt more reasonable. Whereas if it was my own self-talk that just like rose and was like, don't do it. Don't do it. Why do you want to do it? Are you going to do it? Are you going to, yes, let's do it. No, don't do it. Don't, like that whole conversation would be exactly why I would binge and be like, forget this. I cannot, this is exhausting, is what we were talking about earlier. And that itself. And then also the judgment of it would perpetuate it more, which I think is why our approach to recovery is different than the treatment we may have received, which is to, do things like interrupting that urge. That's like asking, I can't think of a good metaphor, but like when something's just much bigger and you're asking to treat it with something that's just going to get steamrolled. It's like that actually kind of makes it worse because then you feel bad that it didn't work and it never stood a chance of working. So the approach is actually not even about stopping it. It's about what you do around it, before it, after it, what sense you end up making of it, and how you use it as data.
In my bulimia days, I had this, I worked with this NLP guy for like one session. And I don't know if I shared this part in episode 1, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But he was trying to convince me that I did have the power to stop before a binge or mid binge. And he gave the example, like if you were sitting at home and you were eating and you were binging and a burglar broke into your house, wouldn't you stop binging? And I'm like, sure, if a life-threatening situation were to occur in that moment, yes, then my even deeper primal brain, my fight or flight is going to kick in and take over. I just,
Oh man, it's a disservice. It really is. Honestly, I would have been like, how can I set it up that a burglar can come in every time I That's something to think about. So what are some other ways of looking at this question of why am I eating when I don't want to be eating that we haven't talked about yet, or ways of approaching it? Maybe if this has become a habit loop, how would you even begin to change the experience of this happening for yourself?
Never underestimate the power of habits because they can be so compelling. I mean, take something like smoking. Many people who have the habit of smoking would prefer not to have that habit. So there can be that sense of doing something you don't want to do because it's so habitual. And I think that when it comes to something like habit, particularly around food, is people focus on trying to get rid of the habit. So they want to just try and stop it. And then the brain kind of goes, well, no, hang on, there's something missing here, because when you sit down and you watch EastEnders, like we always eat these particular foods and this is what we do on a Monday night. And that sense of absence, I think, can bring up all kinds of deep existential feelings that just feel way bigger than whether you're eating a bag of minstrels in front of the TV or not. So I think that when it comes to habit breaking, it's not about getting rid of old habits, it's about bringing in new ones. So this is where the planning in advance, I think, can be helpful. It might be something like, and it's trying to do it in a way that doesn't trigger off restriction, because I think that can happen as well. When it comes to habits, it can just be, to begin with, like swapping around the order that you eat something, changing the times, bringing it forward, moving it back, if it's that habituated. And then there might be slightly bigger changes where it might be, I'm gonna eat my dinner without distractions. Not saying anything about what happens afterwards yet, like not setting myself too big a challenge. I'm going to check in with how I'm feeling when I get in from work, deciding that in advance rather than wait until you get in, the urge to come and you're going, oh no, I need to check in with how I feel now. This whole setting it up and finding ways to remember as well, because I think these are the kinds of things that the brain just likes to forget when it wants to play out its habits. So I'm a big fan of like post-it notes, or just putting something in a different place that you wouldn't normally put, leave something in the middle of the kitchen table that wouldn't normally be there. And when you walk in and you see it, you're like, oh, that's to remind me to do that thing. So if I'm going to bed at night and I want to remember something in the morning, I've already turned the light out, I'll pick something up and just throw it into the middle of the room. And then when I wake up and I see that thing on the floor, I'm like, Oh
I
yeah,
do
that was
that.
because I needed to send that
I do that
email or
too.
do that thing.
That's so funny.
And I think we
Um,
can do that with this as well. Like we can move things around. Anything that changes in your environment that's going to snap you out of that autopilot that we're going through will help you to remember about implementing. So rather than it being like, I want to stop doing this, to really be able to imagine what you would be doing instead.
yeah. And I think it comes down to knowing the charge behind it. And does the thought of it being a habit loop feel true? Or does it feel like, oh yeah, I really wish it was a habit loop, but it's coming from a much more urgent place. And this is a binge that really does need to play out. Like there's something about knowing, can you even have this conversation with yourself? Or and that's really important. If you're eating when you don't want to because your appetite is at play versus we've gotten into a habit of this, or this is a way that we feel like we're avoiding restriction. And I mean, these are completely different reasons behind why we're eating, and knowing the difference is a big deal because one is more, okay, we can work with that. We can set up a boundary even, reflecting on the episode where we talked about rules versus boundaries and implementing boundaries if this is something that's truly in support of us versus something we're using as a way to control. So I think knowing why the eating is happening and if it is truly that you don't want to be, or if there is a part of you that really does need to be eating this food and there's a reason that's happening outside of your conscious awareness.
Because habits are just so predictable generally. You tend to know when they're going to occur, they happen in a certain way. And I think
Yeah.
if your binges seem to be taking you by surprise, there isn't the same pattern. There might be something else beyond habit going on. I think there
Yeah.
are some people out there who talk about binge eating and eating disorders in general as just habits.
Yeah. Oh. I feel like with habits, if something's truly a habit, I don't respond with fear or threat. I've noticed this. I think any habit that I've tried to change before that was not ready to be changed or it wasn't truly habit based, I had like a lot of apprehension or resistance around changing it. But things like now I'll notice that I'm like, oh, I think this is a habit. And if it truly is, I'm much more open to that dialogue. I'm much more open to changing it or adding something else in, or looking at it in that moment. It doesn't feel like a problem. It doesn't feel like, I think that's for me the way my body will tell me that difference. Um, of course, I'm sure that can get more complicated depending on how that habit is serving you. But it seems like something I can have more of a discussion with myself about if it's truly just a habit.
Mm-hmm. I think where I might see people sometimes think it's a habit when there might be a bit more going on is that idea of when they're on their own, they binge. So they might be like, well, it's just a habit to binge when I'm on my own. But I think that what often happens, particularly with people who might live with people, the binging has to be much more planned and secret, is that when you're on your own, you suddenly have this window of opportunity. And if you don't binge now, when are you going to get to binge again? So it has to be now. Otherwise, like, who knows? And that I think is a slightly different dynamic playing out than something that's just become habituated. It's the restrictive thinking in process, really, because you feel like in other times you can't eat freely. So this is the one time that you can.
Yeah.
And that can feel like it's out of your control. You're eating when you don't really want to. You're eating because you feel like you have to, because you've got the chance.
Yeah, right. It's your window. Same for night eating. I think that a lot of people will say, I have a habit of eating at night. And it's a habit because when everyone goes to bed, that's when I just sit on the couch and I mindlessly eat. Could be a habit. Could also be a result of, again, this is my self-care time and it's the only time we allow ourselves pleasure or relaxation. But that's not necessarily habit. That's something else. Or that there's been restriction going on during the day or eating the least amount possible during the day. And then this gets saved up for at night. It's not necessarily that it's the habit. It's just that it happens to take place at night. This is coming from a different source though. Yeah.
And then there's a crossover, which is habit, really, how the brain will associate certain things with food or binging. There would be certain places to me that would have been associated with certain foods. And if I can't buy them now, who knows when I'm going to be back here and I can buy these foods. So I better buy a lot of these foods while I'm here as well. Now I don't trust myself. I've got all these foods, panic, restrictive thinking, binge on the lot.
For me, so much of that went away when my restriction, both physical and mental restriction, healed. Like I had places that were binge, they were just binge associated. Like when I would go there, I would buy these foods and then I would binge on them in the car. That's the way it was. And then when my restrictions stopped and when my binge eating went down, I went to that same store and that urge was gone. Like it just wasn't there. So although there was a habit involved, I didn't have to actively undo it. It undid itself because the restriction was underneath it.
Mm-hmm. I suppose associations, whether to have something, whether not to have something. So last Saturday night, I was going around a friend's house. There were a couple of us going over and we were having a bit of a sleepover. Now, just because it's a Saturday night, it didn't even need to be voiced. There was this assumption that we're going to drink alcohol, and there's always crisps, potato chips, like a lot of them around. And I remember going along and thinking, I'm going to try. And it was this sort of experimental thing because I didn't want to feel like I have to eat and drink in this situation, just because that's what I would always do on a Saturday night with my friends. So I went in and I go, right, I'm not going to drink any alcohol, and I'm not going to eat crisps. And I'm just going to see how that feels. And I went, and I was really expecting some pushback, especially around the alcohol. I went in armed with all my excuses ready. They went to give me a glass of Prosecco, and I said, oh no, I'm not going to drink tonight. And my friend was like, oh, okay, fine, but you're still staying over, right? And I was like, yeah, I'm still staying over. Because I guess she figured I thought I could just drive home if I'm not drinking. And like, that was it. That was the only thing that was said about it. I'd really geared myself up for it. So I didn't drink, and the crisps were there. It didn't feel like a resistance thing because it was so interesting because it was such a completely different mindset that when I said to myself, oh, don't eat the crisps, I just want to know what this feels like. I just want to know what my levels of comfort are with this. And it was fine. I didn't even miss like either of it. And I thought, how much of this, it got me thinking the idea of habit or association. I assumed if on a weekend I'm getting together with my friends and they're drinking and they're eating these foods, that to be a part of that, there was a whole story around that. And that's not to say I will definitely go on another night and I will have some drinks and I will eat some crisps, but it was such an interesting experience for me to go and not do that. It did not feel like you said about knowing when something's habit, because there's like a panic that goes off in your brain otherwise. There was no panic, there was no fear, because also at any time I felt like I can change my mind if I want to.
Right.
There wasn't a rigidity around it.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, it's like the why you did it was different.
You
know, why you were, and the meaning of it. Like this morning, my kids went to, it was the first day of school. We're recording this in early September. And they had French toast for breakfast, and I had eaten breakfast earlier and I was full. But I was clearing their dishes. And I think this is a common habit especially for moms, where you're clearing dishes, leftovers, mac and cheese, all these things. And it's like, there's just a little left and I didn't want to put it away, but I also didn't want to throw it away. It was like, ugh. So it was just so tempting to just like pick it up and eat it. Plus it's good. I mean, it looked really good. I just wasn't hungry for it. And it was like, that's one of those things that can become a habit. I did actually have the last two pieces, honestly, because I just didn't want to put it away. And it was like, well, it tastes good. It will taste good going down. So I did. But if I had asked myself not to, or if it was in a pattern of doing this and I was saying like, I'm trying to break this habit of doing this, I would have had that conversation with myself too and been like, okay, don't have it. Like I just quickly made that decision. But if I'd asked myself not to, I could have easily not have had it and it would have also been fine. Whereas a few years back, if you had said, don't have the French toast, it wouldn't have been because I'm trying to break a habit or for any other reason except don't eat more calories. And so that in and of itself would have made me eat that French toast all the faster for a totally different reason than it happened now. And so this idea of the difference between, the same action of eating something when you don't want to and being able to do something differently, it's going to be more accessible to you if it's coming from a place where there's not this charge behind it or this hidden agenda behind it. All righty, Sarah, what do you say? That's my grounds.
I say it's probably time for us to draw today's episode to a close. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com. And you're welcome to connect with us on Instagram at lifeafterdietspodcast. So thanks again, Stef, for a very enlightening conversation. I got a lot out of it. I hope people did as
always.
well. And I will see you next week.
Bye, everyone.